Welcome to the second Athena SWAN lecture, Women in Science. We are delighted to welcome all of you, and particularly our special guest, Professor Valerie Beral. It's a great honor for us and for me especially to welcome Valerie. As you probably most of you know very well, Valerie has been one of the major contributors to cancer epidemiology over the past decades. She's done fantastic work in different settings and in different areas of epidemiology and public health. Valerie had her medical education in Australia and then moved to a place very well known to many of us, the postgraduate school of at Hammersmith, isn't it? And from there, as you can see in her Wikipedia page, it appears that she became very, very interested in epidemiology and public health and moved to the London School, where she worked for many years very successfully with Professor Reid. And it is from the London School that eventually she moved to join the group led by Sir Richard Doll in Oxford, and to become the head of what was at that time, I think, the Imperial Cancer Research Fund, ICRF was, and now Cancer Research UK, CRUK, Cancer Research UK unit, one of the most important cancer epidemiology unit around the world. Besides, out of the many studies in which Valerie has been leading, has been involved, there are two I'd like to mention personally. I mean, one is EPIC, because the unit led by Valerie is one of the major contributors of the European prospective investigation on cancer study, and Valerie and their colleagues have enormously contributed intellectually to the start of this study 20 years ago and to successfully running it. But most importantly, the EPIC multiplied by 2, the EPIC is 500,000 participants, and there is the Women Million study, which actually you went much above the target. I think it's 1.3 million. But for short, it's still 1 million women study before becoming, and they may become a 2 million women study. A project that is unique in the world. Is the only prospective core study on women to investigate health in women, specifically designed with that particular purpose, initially with questionnaires and then with blood samples. So a unique, fantastic project which combines clearly scientific interest with a much broader public health agenda for, let's say, health in women. And this is what Valerie is going to talk about today, and I welcome here, and thank you very much for being with us.
I want to start by congratulating you at Imperial for already having a silver award. There are not many universities or departments in universities that have an Athena SWAN silver award, so that's quite an achievement. As you know, and I think I'll probably just start with my lecture because I've also got one of these symbols for the Athena SWAN symbol, and it is, and just to, I don't think I'm going to go through the acronym. I believe Sonia is going to speak later about what Athena SWAN is about, but it's a charter for women in science and recognising commitment to advancing women's careers in STEMM, which means science and related technologies in academia. And so I think so. If any of you are expecting me to talk about women in science and careers, I really don't. It's something that I feel very passionate about, and it's very important to me. But to say anything more than that about figures, about what's going on, I think would just show up my ignorance. And so I think I will just start by that. I'm not going to say more about it, other than it's something that I obviously support, and there are many women in the audience who recognise that this is very important. Instead, I'm going to talk largely about work that I've been doing, and again, apologies, that just is the way, but it does fit in some sort of logical order to the way people think about health, because as Elio, well, maybe I'll go on to the next slide and maybe just explain what I'm going to do, because to understand what's important in health and what women can do about it, actually there are a couple of things you've got to have in the back of your mind before you start, and I'm going to come back to this slide quite a bit, because it does underlie quite a lot of what I'm saying. The point is that there are, and I've just picked these conditions, they're not necessarily, which is the slide, they're not necessarily all the important conditions, but they are quite major, quite common diseases. Heart disease, I've got dementia there in small, I'll talk about dementia in a minute. Hip fracture, osteoporosis, which is a manifestation of osteoporosis, breast cancer, and venous thrombosis, that's there for a reason, I'll explain in a minute. These are some of the most common conditions that affect women, that women often fear. They actually fear, I think, breast cancer most of all, osteoporosis as they get older, and dementia as they get older. Curiously, women are not so worried about heart disease, although, as you can see, certainly from the women in their 60s, 70s and 80s, it is the most common condition that's likely to occur. But but you really need to think, there are a couple of things you need to think about when you think about what women can do, as I say, to prevent some of these conditions or do something about these conditions. You've got to know, first of all, something about when these conditions occur. And I've got venous thrombosis, you'll see there, because it's the most common condition out of all of these for women in their 20s and 30s. And I'll come back again, I'll sort of explain on this. You've got to know two things. What's common at the age when you need to be thinking about health? And secondly, if there are behaviours that affect the risk of these diseases, and there certainly are, you have to know whether what you do at a certain age is going to persist. Does it matter if you see, if everything was decided by the time you're 20 or even the time you were born, if your whole life trajectory was already, in terms of health, was already sorted out, you wouldn't actually have to think about, I mean, you know, it would be just bad luck. You could go and have your genes tested and a few other things. But if whatever you did didn't matter, or didn't matter from an early age, what I was saying, and you all self-evidently know this is not true, and I think then you wouldn't have to worry about it. So you have to know at what age does a certain exposure matter, and what's its persistence. If for example, and I will use the example of venous thrombosis in the pill, if we know that, we all know that the risk of thrombosis is increased from the pill users, but it's only increased in people who are taking the pill. As soon as you stop, it goes away. So it's something that you worry about when you're young, but it actually goes away. So you have to know, is it something that you do now that affects the risk, or is it that when you take the pill, it's going to affect something for the rest of your life? And they're very different questions. And so the things I'm really going to talk about is what's important and when it's important, and do the effects persist. So that's, in a way, what my talk's going to be about. And I'm going to take it I'm going to start at different ages and talk about that. And the bottom line, and let me just tell you that in case you get lost or want to go or something, I mean, the bottom line is, yes, we do know none of these things most of these things have very strong environmental determinants. But the more we learn about them, the more we see that they're reversible. So that if you lose weight, it's a good thing. If you stop taking the pill, it helps. Most of the things, if you stop smoking, and I'm going to show that, it's good. You get huge benefits, and really surprisingly quickly. So the message is really, you can do things, and most of the things you can do actually look as if they're reversible. And so it means that there's no, it's sort of never too late to change in a way, for many things, not for everything. I'm going to show you some things that are persistent and some things that are reversible. So that's that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to start off with the pill, as I mentioned. And just point out that at the age when people take the pill, mostly people in their 20s and 30s, it's venous thrombosis that's really quite important. It's more common than heart disease, really rare, breast cancer, women in their 20s, 30s, hardly. Once you get up to 40, and I'll come back to this, once you get up to 40, you see breast cancer starts getting common. So it does depend, again, on the age you are. Now, I also, curiously, but it's probably not so curious, also curiously, my first work, when I was at medical school, the pill was just before the pill became available. And actually, a lot of my early work was on the pill. And when I was in my 20s and 30s, when I got older, I did work on HRT. And you can see that the issues for HRT is heart disease and breast cancer, because that's what's most common for women in their 50s, when most people take HRT. So it's not necessarily just the particular effects of, say, an exposure at a certain age. It's actually what's common. So that's why there's been so much interest in HRT and heart disease in particular, with breast cancer and heart disease with HRT, because they're the ages when it really matters, and they're the conditions that really matter. Hip fractures and osteoporosis, although there's a great interest in HRT often was prescribed for bone disease, it only becomes a problem in later life. And I will say that as I get older, my last, I hope it's not my last, but I'm increasingly actually working on, we're doing work on dementia now, and also osteoporosis. And I'm just going to show you a couple of slides, particularly one on dementia. So I am moving actually out of there onto here, and so I will touch upon them, but I'm going to start. But oh yes, this is just to sort of summarise what I've said. It's because disease rates vary by age, and certain exposures vary by age. I'm just going to go through the sort of exposures that one commonly hears about, the pill HRT, which is mostly work I've done, but also adiposity, physical activity, alcohol and diet, and smoking. Now, first of all, what's the size of these effects? What's really, because it's the magnitude of the effects important, and are these effects persistent? So they're the findings that's what I'm going to sort of concentrate on. And the pill to start with. Now, as I said, I started doing work on the pill. The pill was first licensed in 1960, which is 50 years ago now. And now, I don't think there's any drug that's been as widely used, maybe aspirin occasionally, but by as many people and for so long. So there are about 600 million women in the world who have used the pill now. 120 million are currently using it, and interestingly enough, 2/3 of them are in third world countries now. It used to be, until not long ago, it was mostly in Western countries, but now it's not, it's the reverse. But in Western countries, so maybe it doesn't seem odd to you because you're all young and you think the pill's been around for a long time, but I can remember it coming, being in the newspapers, people very unhappy what it would do to society. But if you take women in Western countries now, and women in their 60s, about 80% have ever used the pill, most of them. And the average is about 7 years, so they use it for not only have they used it, but for an average of 7 years. Look at women in their 90s now, 30% have used the pill, and for the average of 5 years. So that the pill really has been around. And I think, when I was putting this together, it still is probably the most studied, maybe HRT is taking over, but it is the most studied drug. And rightly, because it was very common, used by so many women. Now, so it came out in the US and UK about 59, 60, 61. But already, in 61, there was a report of a young woman on the pill with venous thrombosis. By 62, 26 cases of venous thrombosis have been reported to the FDA, that's the drug regulatory body in the US. By 62, there was a first report of a young person on the pill with stroke. By 64, we had reports of coronary disease. So very, very quickly after the pill came out, there were adverse effects, all vascular, reported. And to cut a long story short, there is, and it varies when the studies and the different types of medications. I'm not going to go through it all, but basically there's a 2 to 4-fold increase in the risk of venous thrombosis, stroke and heart disease in people taking the pill. As I've shown you before, it's only venous thrombosis that quantitatively matters. And the other thing is that it's really clear these effects are all reversible. So if you take the pill, you increase risk. Soon after you stop, they go away. Now, when the pill first came out, actually the concerns were about cancer. But from the first 20 years, all the research was on vascular disease. But what happened in the 1980s and 90s is the emphasis changed to cancer, which, as I said, was what the first animal studies have suggested there might be a risk, particularly of cancer of the uterine cervix. And so I came, and this is really where I came in, although I had done some of the work on vascular disease earlier, but in the 1980s, there were over 30 studies had looked at the results of breast cancer in the pill, and the findings were really very conflicting. And some people, and again, if you keep thinking about that age of breast cancer risk going up with age, some had suggested, some of the people were saying that there were long-term persistent increase in breast cancer risk, and that would have been catastrophic had that been true. And that obviously wasn't true, but that was the fear. But some large studies didn't find this, and there was a lot of controversy. And I moved to Oxford in 1989-90, and really at the height of this controversy, where people would, be on the podium and someone would stand up and pull the microphone from them and overshout them and stuff. It was very, very heated, very emotional. And one of the, well, does it matter? On one side was certain people from Oxford were on one side of this, major people on that one side of the argument, and there were people at Centres for Disease Control in Atlanta who were on the other side of the argument. And I'd actually just come from, I'd spent a year in Centre for Disease Control in Atlanta and just come to Oxford, and I'd not actually worked on breast cancer, not done any work on breast cancer at all by then, at that time. And so I talked to various people, and to cut a long story short, I think many of you know Richard Peto, who's here, and Richard Doll, who were very involved in this, and this is a meeting because I talked to them, and Richard Peto looked at me in disgust when I said I was going to use the published data to do some meta-analysis. He said, you've got to get the original data. And so other people had tried, I want to say other people had tried to do that before me, but they all had they were all on one side of the camp. They were either on one side of the camp or the other, and I hadn't done any work on it, but I had worked on the pill. And I had the backing of Richard Doll, which was quite a thing, and the sort of scientific backing of Richard Peto. So anyway, we set up this collaborative group, Hormonal Factors in Breast Cancer, to bring together the worldwide data, the primary worldwide data, and analyse it and have a look at the effects of the pill on breast cancer. And people thought, when we wrote to them, a lot of people said we couldn't do it. It's a long story I could tell, but I won't. But basically it was extraordinarily challenging, as they say, to do this. But we did get the data. We did get all but one study in the world that had done research, gave us original data. And we did have a meeting. We did have, as soon as we could analyse the data, the findings were crystal clear. And I'm going to just leave this on for a bit of a while because it's really so unexpected, and it was, of the hundreds and hundreds of editorials and reviews in the topic, what we found was about the only thing that nobody had suggested. They'd suggested all sorts of interpretations of all this disparate data, but not this. People hadn't presented the data that way. What we found, I'm just going to go through, this is never use the pill, this dotted line, and the points tell you the relative risk and the confidence intervals. What we found, and this is current users of the pill here, and this is years by stopping up to 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. What we found was there was, and it's a small risk, relative risk of 1.24 with quite a confidence interval in current users. There was an increased risk in current users which disappeared, fell away after women stopped taking the pill and was gone about after 10 years after stopping. There was no excess risk. So it meant that the pill was increasing the risk of cancer while you were taking it and soon after, but not in the long term. So in other words, this risk was reversible. And it was really the first time, certainly in my mind, and certainly in just thinking about things in general, it was the first time that clear evidence that a cancer risk was reversible, because there was such a long view, and still today, most people who write about cancer or discuss cancer and cancer etiology say we have to understand cancer develops 30 years after you're exposed. There's this long latency. Unless you know what's going on 30 years before, you won't understand. There's this long latency. And it's not reversed. So there's this still an idea that and there's really actually no real evidence to back that up, but it's so widely believed that it's extraordinary. And I'm going to show you more and more where cancer is reversible. And so isn't that it? So that really got us thinking. It was quite a shock, and actually such a shock, as I said, that it was not a single person who wrote a review about the evidence said, well, maybe there's just an increased risk while you're taking the pill and it goes when you stop. So it was quite revolutionary, first of all, to get all the data and sort it out, get a clear pattern, and get everyone to agree. We showed the data, we showed each of those points in the first morning of the meeting when all the collaborators who'd been almost at fisticuffs came, and we showed how every study contributed to every point. And when we broke for coffee after the first, 11 o'clock, everyone was friends and it was accepted, and it changed views because it was so clear that was, and that explained the studies that hadn't found an excess were studies of older women where most had stopped. The ones who had were younger women where they were taking it. It was completely clear. So it's, but it's also interesting, this idea that maybe things that cause cancer are reversible. Now, I'll just say, in case you're thinking, well, maybe it's just that these would have been cancers anyway, and they just appeared with a pill. If this was just making cancers that are already there appear, you'd get a deficit in the end. You'd have to get, you'd have to say after stopping you've got a deficit because you're taking the cancers away. There's no deficit. And this is true for lots of examples I'm going to give you. So that's what we found about the pill. We published it now quite a while ago, but it was quite important. Now, we've published since. Now, there are two other cancers, cancer of the ovary and cancer of the endometrium, the womb. Now, you can't see these, but this is, and you can't see what this isn't time since stopping. This is actually duration of use. This is duration of the pill, duration of the pill. And what it's showing you can't exactly see it, is that the longer you've taken the pill, the greater the protection, and these are relative risks of 0.5, 0.4, so you can halve the risk of cancer of the ovary with 5, that's about 7 years use of the pill, about 12 years it's less than half, and cancer of the endometrium, it's the same. But what these different lines show, this is if you stopped in the last 10 years, this is if you stopped 10 to 19 years ago, this is if you stopped 20 to 29 years ago, and this way there's less data, is if you stopped less than 15 years ago, 15 to 30 years ago. So basically, cancer, but what you find, it's not true for everything. You can't generalise just saying because of breast cancer you find this, it must be true for everything else. No, for cancer of the ovary and cancer of the endometrium, actually, the longer, and I'm going to repeat that because that's quite in thinking about the net effect. The longer you've taken it, the better. And this is a very fatal cancer of the ovary. It's the 5th most common cancer in women. It's very fatal. It's about the 3rd most common fatal cancer. So it's a serious condition, and so the longer you've taken it, and it persists. So there you are, two different things. One was just taking it short-term mattered for breast cancer, ovary and endometrium. The longer you took it, and it's a persistent effect. But if you do the sums, and I'm not going to go through all of this now, but you just have to more or less believe me, that so if you take it a decade or so after stopping the pill, you've got all the effects of the the effects on vascular disease and on breast cancer, and also there was a very similar pattern for cervix cancer as breast cancer. But once you've got over the kind of ill effects of taking it, plus a bit of the lag effect, you end up with the net effect of the pill in women who are postmen, women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, the net effect, they've taken the pill, the longer they've taken it, the better. So, so that really the message for the pill, just going back to this, is just because they're really the main effects, vascular disease while you're taking it, breast cancer while you're taking it, but goes away, and then endometrial and ovarian protection. Now, so what you want to do to maximise the benefits is you want to take the pill for as long as possible, but you don't want to take it for too long, because you don't want to get, this is my view, which is not reflected by regulatory bodies or even, and I wish they would, but anyway, that's my view, is that, or by gynecologists, is that once you get to 40, you should think about it a bit, because here you see breast cancer is more common than these other conditions, and you don't want to increase breast cancer. You don't want, see, it's the dominant condition by then. So the sensible, if you really want to maximise the benefits of the pill, leaving aside the contraceptive benefits, it's really to start the pill as young as possible, and take it for as long as possible, but start thinking about stopping at about 40. That's really the bottom line, and it's been around for so long, we really know what's going on with the pill. So that's sort of the message. So what about HRT? Now, why do people, and I call it HRT, hormone, because that's the common terminology, hormone replacement therapy it stands for, and after some of the trials in America they showed it's used to replace hormones at the menopause. I'm going to go back to that, but now the R has gone out of the word and they call it HT, but no one who's other than working in the field gets that subtlety. But see, now what happens at around 50, and now so shown 49 on average, but let's say 50, women become menopausal. And what's menopause? It's got definitions, but it's actually when their ovaries stop producing estrogens and other hormones. That's what the menopause is. It happens around this age. And what happens if you look at these disease rates? Just look at these disease rates that happen around the menopause before I talk about. The first thing, can you see how breast cancer was shooting up until the menopause, and then it sort of flattens out? And this sort of dip, the fact that it doesn't continue to go up, is actually because at the menopause estrogen levels fall to a very low level, and estrogens or hormones in general, ovarian hormones, that are driving a lot of the breast cancer. So the big drop in hormone levels that occurs when the ovaries stop functioning, that's why breast cancer rates have this shape and they flatten out. And the same is true for ovarian and endometrial. They all are going up fast and then they flatten out. By contrast, I'm going to show you, look at what happens to hip fracture, which is osteoporosis. It's sort of going along and it takes off a bit later, but it does the reverse. Well, the ovarian hormones, one of their main functions is to keep bones strong, to lay down calcium and things in the bone. And at menopause, it's very well known and well studied that the estrogen levels fall, and the fall in estrogen means that the bones start thinning. And so these sort of funny age patterns you see here, the breast cancer falling and the hip fractures, which is a manifestation of osteoporosis, shooting up like that, is consequence of menopause, and in particular the estrogenic effect. So that's why there was this idea that HRT, if you gave hormones to replace this drop, you would actually be doing women good. And the bottom line is, as you'll see, is that basically what happens, it really is almost like this, is that if you give HRT, instead of this breast cancer turning down, it keeps going up. You're basically just keeping the trajectory the way it would have been without the menopause, and the hip fractures go right down, and so you drop this. So you're basically, on this very simplistic age-specific incidence, you're just reversing two of these age patterns that are due to the hormones, and they are the main effects. What I shall show is on breast cancer. It's just as if you didn't have a menopause, and that's not a good idea for breast cancer, but for hip fracture it's a very good idea. But I'll just go through, and it's really a sort of simple-minded view. So they were right to call it hormone replacement therapy, because that's exactly what it did. But there you are. Now, when we did when we were doing this collaboration on the pill, it was already clear that there was increased risk of and because just going back, and it's because breast cancer is so much common, the age people take HRT than when they were taking the pill, it was clear there was increased risk. It was clear that the data weren't strong enough, that the sorts of types of the composition of the HRT were different, particularly in Europe and America. Most of the evidence was American. That we started the Million Women study, and as earlier said, it ended up as 1.3 million women. We recruited them from about half the screening centres, breast screening centres in UK, 1996, 2001. We really was particularly, the first thing was to look at breast cancer and HRT, but to look at women's health in general. We ended up with 1 in 4 of all women in the UK at that age at the time of recruitment. They were 56 now, then, and they're 70 now, which is why I say we're starting to get interested in dementia. But our first work and our first publications were on HRT and cancer incidence. And I'm just going to show you, because this is really quite important. And there are 2 types. So this is never uses of HRT. And then there are 2 types of HRT. There's just estrogen only, which are widely used mostly used in the US. But it was shown in the US quite some decades ago that cancer of the endometrium, the womb of the lining, cancer of the lining of the womb, was increased in women taking estrogen-only HRT. And this could be reversed by giving progestogen. So you could, and you can see, this is our findings, you can see there was an increase. It's true, people taking estrogen only had a higher, if they had a uterus, had a higher risk of endometrial cancer, cancer of the womb, and the progestogens, addition of the progestogens reverse it. That's true. But what also happened, and what was kind of unexpected and unanticipated, was the addition of this progestogen to the HRT formulations did this massive, much greater increase in breast cancer rates. So estrogen only, there was an increase, but it was nothing like with estrogen and progestogen. And I'm just going to show you these totals to give a quantitative idea. This is just if you take all these cancers together. These are incidence rates over 5 years in 1,000 women. So this is, if you never used HRT, I mean, it's not like cancers don't occur if you don't use HRT. About 20 women in 1,000 would get one of these 3 cancers in a 5-year period. So that's, you can think of as 2%, 2 in 100. What if you take estrogen plus progestogen? It's over 30, so in other words 3%. So it goes up. So it's 1% more. It's and it's largely breast cancer, as you can see. So 1 woman in 100 who takes HRT for 5 years will get breast cancer if they take estrogen plus progestogen, which is quite a high risk. It's smaller, as you can see, for estrogen only. But you see, all the risks I was talking about of thrombosis with the pill or anything, they were all measured in the 1 in 10,000 range. But this is 1 in 100. So it's a much bigger risk. It's because the relative risks are quite high, but also because the background rates are high. So this is quite serious. And the MHRA, which is the UK equivalent of its regulatory body in the UK, has since 2002 advised, it was really from the randomised trials in the States that showed that there weren't benefits in other conditions. They've said women should use HRT for as short a time as possible. And I'm just going to say there are a couple of things, because I think there are a few things they could say. I'm disappointed that they never said, really, don't take it. You know, estrogen plus progestogen is much worse than estrogen only, because it really would cut a lot of the excess breast cancers and other things, as you'll see, if they also said something about the type of HRT. And so I'm just going to show you a few results, and I will go on to other things. I'm just going to look at the time. That actually, this is the same result I showed you before, but just in a different format, that estrogen plus progestogen just about doubles the risk of breast cancer. Estrogen only, it's about a 30% increase. But there are 2 sorts of estrogen, type of estrogen, the way they, what do they call it, mode of delivery or something. You can actually have an oral estrogen only, or a patch or cream, which is very popular in France. It's very curious. In France, most of the HRT is used as creams in France. It's just a sort of cultural thing. Here it's oral, and I think in the States it's almost no transdermal use at all. I mean, it's just cultural, really. So you could say, oh, well, there's not much difference here. I mean, both transdermal in our study and oral increase the risk of breast cancer, but it's not only breast cancer, and these are just some other conditions. Just to show you, this was the breast cancer, that's what I showed you before, but, you know, HRT increases the risk of gallbladder disease. Cholecystectomies are really common in women, and it's rather similar if it's estrogen only or progesterone, but transdermal, because if you put it on the skin, if you take a hormone, if you swallow it, it's first passed through the liver, it goes through the liver, goes into the blood and into the liver. And so, and it had actually been suggested that maybe transdermal would stop that, reduce the risk, and it really does. So transdermal is much better for gallbladder disease. And for thromboembolism, which we know is associated with the pill, look, there's quite a difference. First of all, estrogen progesterone is worse than estrogen only, but the transdermal has no effect at all. So again, in my view, if the regulatory bodies were being a bit more, and we're certainly not the only ones to find this, that there really should be a bit more of a encouragement for use of transdermal methods. So just sort of say, I'm just going to say coronary heart disease is a mess, these are trial results. There's certainly no decrease in the risk, and there's probably little or no increase, and there's probably no effect of different types. So this is just my assessment. We don't know. The idea that people keep repeating that, oh, in young women it protects you still, it's just not true, and not true, and I can argue with people if they want to. There's an increase in stroke with both estrogen only and estrogen progesterone from the trials. Again, it doesn't get much attention, and stroke's a pretty serious thing. So, and both the vascular things are thought to be to go away, and the bit of evidence that's published does suggest that that's reversible. But look at this HRT. This is really, again, I'm going to go back to this we were talking about before. I showed you, this is the same as I showed you for the pill, but it's even a more sharp decline. I think we've got better data, quite frankly, but that's this is the dotted line here for never users of hormone replacement therapy, and this is past use by years since stopping. Quite a big risk, this is all types to get on the current users. By a year or two, there's still a significant excess, but it's largely gone away. And by 3-4 years, there's no excess at all, and definitely no deficit. So again, just like the effects of the pill, the HRT effects are reversible. And most of what we know, I can't say, and the same is true for the bones, the prevention of bone disease is also reversible. So there's no point taking HRT when you're 50, thinking you won't get osteoporosis when you're 80, because the bone changes are very rapid as well. So again, these, and this is just to show that not only was it observational data that showed from particular studies showing that that there was that's reversible, but there have been a dozen published papers now. This is Peter Rabden, the first one from the US, showing that as HRT prescribing fell during the 2002-3, so did breast cancer rates in women in their 50s and 60s. And what's more, the estrogen receptor, there's some breast cancers that are estrogen responsive to estrogen, they're the ones that increase in HRT, and that's the ones that fell, whereas the ones who are estrogen receptor negative didn't fall. So we've seen, and this is ecologically, that this rapid reversal actually a drop in breast cancer rates. And this is just to show you, because this is my future research, that what's happened though is we've had this drop in HRT use. There's still quite a few women, there's still a million women or so in this country on HRT, so it's not dropped completely. But it's dropped a lot, but typically there's something else that's happened instead. And bisphosphates that you may not have heard of, but bisphosphates are drugs that are used to prevent osteoporosis, or not to prevent, they're supposedly to prevent fractures. And what's happened is there's been this absolute massive increase, almost as women, because a lot of women prescribed HRT for their bones, so it's not as simple as that, but it looks like it when you just grab them like that. So there's been a big increase in prescriptions of bisphosphates, mostly for osteoporosis and to prevent fractures, and that's my future research, looking at that. because there's certainly, we know a lot more about HRT than we do about bisphosphates, and it's being used by very large numbers. Obesity, I'm going to go very quickly through some of these things. Now, these are just some of our findings, because I want to go through it. One thing is that we found that others have hinted at, but never shown so clearly, I think, is that actually childbearing patterns have a persistent effect on women's body mass index when they're postmenopausal. And this is showing, this is women with increasing, the more children you've had, and this is when you're postmenopausal, 50s and 60s, the more children you've had, the greater. It's not huge units, but it's not huge differences, but these are confidence intervals. I mean, it's quite clear. I can't even see the confidence intervals here. So having children, in the long term, you've got a higher body mass index, more obese, and it's also, if you took obesity as the index, we'd find the same thing. But at each level, if you're breastfeeding, we've also shown that the longer you breastfeed, the lower your body mass index. And that's really quite, again, it's something that I think could be said to people, you know, this is it's a persistent effect. I mean, it's not a persistent effect like a drug carrying over effect, but presumably, I mean, it's known that women put on weight around the time. I mean, it's probably just what happens around the time of a birth and never kind of recovers again. But I mean, I'm not saying it's some metabolic permanent effect, but it is something that I think should be better known and thought about, and telling, you know, if you want to be thinner when you're old, if that's, you know, think about breastfeeding for a bit longer. And also, and this is just going back, this is a bit out of kilter with the rest, but, you know, breastfeeding, as I think many of you know, it also causes again, it's a persistent protection. This is allowing for BM, body mass index. It's a persistent protection for breast cancer. So there's a really good idea to encourage, and I understand it's a very, if you talk about breastfeeding in the media, people are very hostile in some sort of way, and I don't understand. It's not my field. I shouldn't have probably even said that. Now, I'm just showing you the evidence. Now, I told you before. No, I didn't tell you. In postmenopausal women, the ovaries stop making estrogen. But what happens in postmenopausal women is that fat cells take over. They take over, and they produce fat. They produce estrogens. So in postmenopause, it's not true in premenopausal women who have ovaries and making quite high levels of estrogen, but in postmenopausal women, where the levels of estrogen are much lower than they were before, fat cells take over production, and so the fatter you are, and this is sort of a doubling between being, this is a sort of good body size, desirable, and this is being obese, it's about a doubling estrogen levels, about twice as high. And that's why, I mean, to put it bluntly, that's why breast cancer, endometrial cancer, womb cancer and ovary cancer in postmenopausal women, the risk of these cancers goes up with body mass index related to obesity. It's basically because of the hormones. And the most extreme is, what I've shown you here, is for cancer of the endometrium and cancer of the womb. Where look, and this is being obese. The relative risk is about 2 or so. But you know, if you've got this is morbidly obese. This is really, really obese. The relative risk is sort of 8. So, and this is largely, if not wholly, where we can look at it wholly, because of the estrogen that are produced by the fat cells in postmenopausal women. Now I'm going to show you one. I've got 2 complicated slides, and this is one of them. And this is to say, and the message of this is to say that actually it's whether you're obese now that matters for endometrial cancer. It doesn't matter what you were before. And I'm going to take this. This is women who have their current body mass index is greater than 30, which means they're obese. This is the definition of obese. So they've got quite a high risk of endometrial cancer here, all the way along. But this is people who, because we've also asked about, we've got measures of people's, we've asked them whether, when they were 10, whether they were thinner than average, about average, or plumper than average. And we've done validation studies to show that this is an index of their body mass index when they were 10, when people were measured. So basically, this circle around here is people who were lean when they were 10, but obese when they were 60. And this is people who were plump when they were 10 and plump and obese when they were 60. So basically, there's no difference. It doesn't matter what you were when you were 10. It doesn't matter where you were when you were 10. You can see it much more clearly here for, this is just more stable results. People who are, this is overweight category. Didn't matter whether you were thin, average or plump when you were 10, just matters what you are now. And this is sort of the other extreme. These are people who are thin now, ideal weights now, but when they were young, they were plumper than average. And you can see it really doesn't matter whether, it doesn't matter what you were. It matters what you were when you were 10, because people who were plumper than average and tended to have a higher BMI later. So it does matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter in the long, it does put you on a trajectory, but there are some who are at the other ends of the trajectory, although there's bigger confidence, they're not that many. But from what we can tell about obesity and endometrial and a lot of conditions, it really is what you are now that matters. So in other words, and this is why I've got to come to it, in other words, losing weight now is a good idea. And you don't have to think, oh, I've been obese for so long, what does it matter now? You know, it still matters. So that's really the message of this rather complicated slide. And then to say that although I've shown you the cancer examples, the big problems with obesity are not cancer really, it's more diabetes, and this is just in the order of some of the conditions we've looked at. Diabetes, this is the order of the most serious. Diabetes and knee replacements, you know, because it's not good for your knees to be overweight. Then it's venous thromboembolism, gallbladder disease, atrial fibrillation, hip replacement, chronic airway disease, ischemic heart disease. These are some of the worst things. But actually, there are a couple of things that it's good to be obese about. And hip fracture is the most extreme, that you're better to be obese. And one thing is, probably the main thing is that if you're obese for the reasons I said, you've got higher estrogen levels, your bones are stronger, but also, as they say, you're more cushioned when you fall. So it's not like obesity, but it's really bad for most things. And obesity accounts, I mean, if you look at deaths, it accounts for, in our study in the UK, but it accounts for about 10% of all excess deaths. Now, physical activity we've started to look at, and I'm going to just show you 2 slides on that, and I'm coming to it. Now, physical activity is interesting because there's a big push on physical activity now, but it's much more complicated, I think, than people say. And this should be strenuous exercise. Rarely, this is up to once a week, more than once a week. And look, for some things it's really good. For hip fracture, it's a good thing. It's a good thing, but, you know, for ankle fracture and particular, you know, it's not. And so people, and we're finding for a few things that it sort of goes up a bit towards the end. And so it may be, it's not, and it's, anyway, it may not be, it's certainly not, we're certainly not getting associations that look like, or we're getting few that look like this, the more the better. There is a bit of a difference, and we're just starting to look at that now. And I think that, but I want to give you an example. This is my second complicated slide, and then I've only got a few more. But there's some real problems with some things with physical activity, and there's a thing called, I don't know if it's a technical word, I call it technical reverse causation. Now this is, I'm going to show you, I said that I'm starting to do work on dementia. Now I'm going to go through this slide because this is a bit complicated, well, just complicated to think about. We've got questions, as you saw from that other one, you know, do you do exercise? Rarely, never, and how often? This is the relative risk if you say you rarely, never do something, inactive versus active. You rarely, never do much. It doesn't matter whether it's vigorous or any sort of activity. This is versus doing something. And now in the first, and this is years of follow-up, this isn't years of doing it or anything. This is from the time they answer the question. Look, in active people, it's 2.3, more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with dementia in the next 4 years. But what happens 4 to 8 years later? It's down to 1.5, and by 8 years it's almost gone. And what we're finding is, and physical activity is not the only thing we're finding this for. What we're finding is, this is evidence that people who are on the way to dementia, who haven't been diagnosed yet, who maybe people haven't noticed, stop doing things. They stop being active. They stop reading. They stop visiting friends. They stop doing things, right? Now, and we've got, they stop smoking, they stop everything. We've got this sort of association for lots of things. And so one reads in the media, run, 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 and you won't get dementia. But probably what they were saying, if you're not running, you may be on the way to get dementia, you know? And I think that there are a few, we're going to learn quite a lot. We're going to have 20,000 people with dementia in the next 5 years in the Men and Women study. And we're going to look at everything in this way. And I think that, I mean, you know, most of the studies that have looked at have only had sort of 4 or 5 years follow-up in these cohort studies, and they found these big, well, we're replicating what they found, but this is not the course, it's the wrong way round. And I think we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful, and that's again my. So you've seen, I'm going to be doing work on bisphosphates and dementia in the next 5 years, because I think we really have to get this. This is really important, and we've got to get this straight and reverse causation. And I think for a lot of physics, I think for quite a few, it's not only dementia where there's this reverse causation. I think it's part of the explanation for the vascular. I think people do slow down if they've got heart trouble and so forth. And so we have to, it is an issue, and it's often talked about in the textbooks, but here's a lovely example. Alcohol and diet, well, Elio, I'm not going to say anything on this. I'm just going to say, this is cirrhosis, liver disease. You know, you don't have to drink much. 1 drink a day increases your risk of cirrhosis. You don't have small amounts. Can journalists say, what is 1 is 2 well, everyone drinks 2, don't they? Well, you know, it does, you know, people, again, there's so much, again, there's a lot of information and hype about drinking being good for you, and you know that certain amounts are good for you, but certainly for cirrhosis, even small amounts you can see significant difference, and obesity matters too for cirrhosis. Now we've just looked at alcohol cancer. I'm just going to use this, but this is listed in terms of the greatest effect per 10 grams, and look, it's all things that you knew. Larynx, it's when you swallow, it's all the things you swallow, plus the liver where it's alcohol is metabolized, that's important. Alcohol increases the risk of liver cancer, larynx cancer, liver cancer, oral and pharynx and mouth, the esophagus. But next comes breast. And in women, this is really important. And I'm just going to show you, this is a bit of a squashy thing, it's not very clear, but this is just showing that this is, a lot of women in the study have only drunk wine, and some drink all sorts of drinks, and it doesn't really matter. It's any alcohol has the same effect. It's just alcohol. And again, with 1 unit, you can still 1 unit per day. 1 drink a day is enough. You've got more. There's a higher risk in women drinking 1 drink a day than drinking, you know, occasionally. And it's about a 10% increase in risk per drink. And as I say, that's where the news media people really very unhappy, because anyway, but breast cancer, the biggest absolute risk in women associated with drinking is breast cancer, and it's quite it's quite important, and I'll come back to talk about that. I'm nearly through now. I've just got something. This is our result, but again, people here have done more work. But certainly, we've just looked at fibre intake and diverticular disease of the bowel. That's where you get little pockets of inflammation in the colon. Very unpleasant, cause a lot of symptoms. Well, you can see fibre intake really, the greater the fibre intake, the lesser the risk of disease, and that's, again, it's a common cause of hospital admission, so that's good. Lastly, I'm going to talk about smoking, then I'm going to just wrap up. Now, these are our results. It was published in The Lancet earlier this year on smoking in women, and these are women who started when they were 19, who are now in their sort of 50s, 60s. Women who smoke 10 cigarettes a day, less than 10, double their risk of all-cause mortality. It's a huge, you haven't seen big relative risks like this. You've been seeing 1.2 and 1.3. This is 2. It's 20, so it was a bit more, 15 cigarettes, 2.8. And overall it's about 3. So if the relative risk for all-cause mortality is about 3, it means that 2 out of every 3 women who die, if they're smokers, have died from smoking-related cancers. This is much higher than anyone had ever found, but then it's the first time that that there were enough it was a big study of enough women who had smoked really from an early age, the way men do. This is very similar to findings for men of similar earlier generation. So these are quite stunning. There's nothing that I've shown you that's as big as this. And just to show how you can get even bigger relative risk, this is lung cancer and smoking. These are different types. This is adenocarcinoma. This is one type of lung cancer where the relative risks just go up to about 20. Small cell squamous and large cell, they go up to 100. You can still get relative risks of 100 in, if you're looking at smoking. It's a complete different order of magnitude to anything I've shown before. But the main thing, and this was the main message from this, and it ties in with everything that I've said before, is the huge benefit from stopping. Remember I said that for all current smokers the relative risk is about 3. So this means an excess relative risk of 2, the difference of 2. Well, if people give up at 40, the relative risk of all-cause mortality is 1.2. 90% of the excess is gone. 90% of the excess is gone by stopping at smoking, stopping at 40, which many people think that might be too late. And stopping at 30, you lose 97%. So stopping smoking is hugely reversible, and again, it counters this view that once you've started smoking, it's too late or something. So that again, it's this same message, and that's really what I think. I've just got one more slide just to sort of summarise what we said. So what have I said? What we definitely know, and I've concentrated on what we do know, not what we think might be true, and I've really tried to only talk about what's definite. And so we really know, and we have to say, as boring as it is, and really, that you shouldn't smoke. It's just overwhelmingly the most important thing. But if you do, you should give up, and you should give up whenever, and it's better to give up now. It doesn't matter how old you are, you'll get the benefits really quite quickly. And smoking, even though relatively few people in the population smoke now, and I would guess that almost no one in this audience does, it still accounts for about 20% of all the deaths in the UK, of all deaths. It still accounts for a huge proportion. Keep weight down. Now, obesity accounts for about 10% of excess deaths, and it's still, although few people smoke and they account for 20% of deaths. Large numbers of people are overweight, obese, but that's 10% of the excess. There is an excess, and they're the two, and they really are the most important in that order. Now, breastfeed, I just say this, if you have children, I think it's really sensible to say you should breastfeed them for longer, and if nothing, it keeps your weight down. It's a way of keeping weight down. It also prevents breast cancer, so that's something that should be slightly more said. Now, exercise, and this is my little thing, but possibly not too much, I'm not sure. I think there might be, I think things do turn up and are very active. Now, I didn't show you about heart attack, but for women, it's really drink as little alcohol as possible. It is true that there is, for heart disease, a small beneficial effect for about 1 drink a day, but not much more. But it kicks in at old age, because you saw how heart disease rates go up. But for younger women, where breast cancer and where cirrhosis is getting much more common, predominates, it really is more of a problem. There's still a bit of a tendency, and I'm sure we're going to go and have drinks afterwards. Which is all right, but it's, just saying, because when Richard Dole published his first work on smoking and lung cancer, 80% of doctors smoked, and it was sort of hard to believe that people couldn't quite believe it was bad, and in a way, so I think that is, particularly in women, it's less clear for men because they don't have this breast cancer risk, because fruit and vegetables seem good for the bowels. So you take the pill, but of course many people are too old now, but take the pill, but you see, I think people should stop before about 40. I think it's, I think that's when the breast cancers start appearing, and you don't want to have the risk of breast cancer. And take menopausal hormones as little as possible, and I would say, and if so, use the transdermal estrogens. That's again my personal view. Now, what I hope you go away with is that many of the effects are reversible. Not everything, I showed you some things that weren't. So it's really too late to get benefit from change. So it's not, you can't it's not right to say, oh, I've been just so long, you know, and I'm too old now. And so that's actually not true. And I'm sure people who run, who sort of started doing running or exercise, know that you can change your body quite quickly with doing things. So it's not too late. And the other thing is, although other than smoking, a lot of the things I've talked about, the relative risks are quite small. And I hear people again saying, oh, you lose all this weight and you just reduce your breast or something heart disease risk by this amount. It's hardly worth it, is it? Well, and you do hear people say that's not worthwhile, but it's all little bits it's all the little bits. They do add up. They don't count. They don't counter each other, and they don't multiply. They just seem to add. So that lots of little things, lots of little changes do make a difference to the net. And so I thank you. And people I work with.